Everyone keeps saying the UK is an absolute political mess right now.
This is hopeless.
So many prime ministers.
It's really chaotic.
We've got another prime minister and a potential future leader who's resigned as an MP and is about to stand for re-election against a man wearing a bin on his head. This isn't normal, right? The theory seems to be that all of these prime ministers in such a short space of time means the UK must be unmanageable, ungovernable. But let me tell you, there's nothing new about it. There have been 4 other times when the UK has had 6 or more leaders in a 10-year period. The late 1820s, 1850s, the late 1880s, and most recently the 1920s, when the headlines then could have been written today.
Will the Prime Minister resign?
In this episode of FourSight, I'm going to use history to explain why a merry-go-round of prime ministers is actually normal.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to reveal 3 crucial factors that lead to this political chaos, and crucially, I'm going to ask the experts about what history can teach us about what might come next. Now, seeing so many leaders come and go might feel unusual, but that's partly a trick of memory, because until recently, we've actually had pretty long-serving leaders.
Britain's first woman Prime Minister will really test her mettle.
Between 1979 and 2007, there was Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and Tony Blair. 28 years and just 3 leaders. That's not normal, because since George Canning took office in 1827, the average time a UK Prime Minister spends in office is 1,275 days, almost exactly 3.5 years. With these 5 distinct periods where there's been lots of changes at the top. But why is that? What's behind these moments of prime ministerial churn? To answer that, I'm zooming in on 2 periods, the 1920s and today. Because as much as a history graduate and geek that I am, and I'd love to relive the political turmoil of the 19th century with you, we don't have all day. And the 1920s is actually a really good period to compare, because between 1922 and 1929, the UK had 6 prime ministers in just 7 years, and 3 elections in 2 years.
Hello.
I spoke to 2 historians of that period,
Let's have a history geek off.
Robert Saunders and Lucy Delap, to find out what actually causes the type of political upheaval we saw back then in the 20s, as well as what we're seeing today. And 3 reasons kept coming up. So let's start with the first one, political and economic shocks. In the 1920s, Britain was coming to terms with the First World War, a campaign that technically delivered victory, but which came at a huge cost. The conflict didn't just destroy countless lives, it destroyed the economy.
Periods of instability are often periods when you have very high public debt. So Britain starts the First World War with a national debt of about £650 million. It ends the war with almost £8 billion of public debt. And what that means is that the governments are having to raise historically high levels of taxation, and they can't give very much in return.
Everything is now derelict and deserted.
The next decade saw industrial unrest, the general strike, and then the Great Depression. It made governing difficult, parties fractured, majorities evaporated, and leaders who couldn't fix it didn't survive long. And all this was happening during the largest expansion of the UK vote in its history. All men over the age of 21 could vote from 1918, and after years of campaigning, women were given equal voting rights a decade later.
Is it where my mother records her vote?
There's new voters on the scene, and parties are really jockeying for those new votes. And you have the returning servicemen who are weapons trained. It seems very risky to have these disgruntled working class men who are angry about not having received the kind of the benefits that they might have expected from fighting in World War I.
Now, not every prime ministerial change came down to crisis, mind you. Andrew Bonar Law resigned through illness, but even then, that forced another election. So that's the 1920s. But what about now? What shocks have we been dealing with? Well, there's the big one, Brexit.
Brexit and the First World War are radically different, but if we're thinking about a shock that disrupts the party system, then there's questions like conscription during the First World War that split a previously dominant political coalition. In the same way, Brexit takes all sorts of tensions within the party system and blows them up.
But it's not just Brexit. It's going back further to the effects of the financial crash, and then more recent shocks such as COVID, the war in Ukraine and Iran, and more generally, a much more volatile global geopolitical picture. And these shocks aren't just a feature of today and back in the 1920s, they define political upheaval throughout our UK history.
A recurring feature for a lot of these periods of instability is that some kind of big political issue explodes which detonates conventional party loyalties. In our time, that's been Brexit. In the 1820s, it's Catholic emancipation. In the 1880s, it's Home Rule for Ireland. In the 1920s, we're dealing with the legacy of the First World War, which has shattered the Liberal Party.
Robert's point is that those big shocks make being Prime Minister difficult because they don't just disrupt government and the economy, they disrupt the parties themselves. And that brings us to our next common thread, the pressure on the two-party system. For more than 100 years, the UK has been dominated by just two parties, Labour and the Conservatives. But right now, both are in crisis. The Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, took control of Wales's parliament, ending Labour's unbroken century of dominance in the country. The Greens made major gains in London, while Reform UK, the right-wing populist party led by Nigel Farage, took control of councils across the country. In our recent episode on Brexit, we showed that while the two main parties secured more than 80% of the vote in the general election in 2017, polling now shows they both are only managing around 20% each. Side note, you should watch that episode after you finish this one if you want to see just how big a shock Brexit was. But back to our political merry-go-round. This isn't the first time the two-party system has been shaken. In the early 20th century, the main parties were the Conservatives and the Liberals. World War I had created major divisions among the Liberals, and that breakdown coincided with the rapid rise of what was then the brand new Labour Party.
The remarkable growth and development of our movement.
While they never won a majority during that period, they did manage to enter government. And over the decade, they kept squeezing the Liberal Party out. By 1931, the UK had a new two-party system.
Westminster is febrile. Parties become impossible to manage. Factions emerge. The centre cannot hold, if you like.
If that sounds familiar, it's because there are clear parallels between Labour in the 1920s and Reform UK today.
Reform are a disruptive party, and people certainly saw the Labour Party in that light.
When Labour forms its first government in 1924, this is absolutely volcanic. You have a former railway driver, Jimmy Thomas, as Colonial Secretary. You have the illegitimate son of a farm labourer, Ramsay MacDonald, as Prime Minister. You have what opponents call wild men all over government.
So we could have the wild men of reform.
It's entirely possible.
And another fascinating parallel between the 20s and today is the public mood about the state of British democracy. Right now, there's plenty of talk about the failure of politicians and politics and questioning whether this system actually works at all. And all of that's happening at a time when we're seeing the rise of populism.
I am your voice.
Nous sommes prêts à redresser le pays, prêts à faire revivre la France.
Guess who's back? Back again.
It's uncanny how similar it feels to the political situation 100 years ago. Commentators and theorists back then were claiming that disillusionment regarding the democratic experiment is wide and deep. Or take this article from a BBC magazine published in 1929. It simply asks, is democracy dying? Communism had swept away the old order in Russia, and the fascist leader Benito Mussolini had marched on Rome. People in the UK were seriously asking, could that happen here too?
They're watching parliamentary regimes collapse across Europe. So there's a very powerful sense that this is a political system under intense stress that might collapse.
And let's not forget that those things are happening in the UK. The Labour Party is constantly having to eject constituency Labour parties that have veered too much into communist sympathies. Fascism is also there in the UK. Maverick figures like Oswald Mosley.
Today, people talk of a political class cut off from the masses. Well, just listen to the words of Oswald Mosley in 1931. He quit as Labour MP to form a party that became the British Union of Fascists.
The country has voted for great changes and for decisive action. Yet again and again, their will has been thwarted by obstruction in the talking shop at Westminster.
Mosley was using the latest technology of the day to reach a wider audience, which brings us to the third driving force of political chaos on our list, new media. The 1920s saw the rise of national daily papers, like the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and the Daily Mirror. At the end of the First World War, they were selling 3 million copies a day, but 20 years later, sales had exploded to 10 million.
These super powerful new daily newspapers, which are cheap, so everyone's reading it, they are setting the agenda.
And a modernising print media was joined by the founding of the BBC in 1922 and the advent of radio and broadcast.
Suddenly everybody is hearing the same news, and that is kind of a force for stability. But it also means that politicians are having to develop new skills. They're having to learn to talk to camera. They're having to learn to talk down a microphone.
How politics and politicians interacted with the public was changed forever. And back then, just like today, there were concerns whether the new tech was destabilising politics or something politicians had to adapt to. Because it's clear today that social media is increasingly where the public gets its news. Over the past decade in the UK, the number of people reading physical newspapers has dropped significantly, TV audiences are declining, while those getting their news from social media has risen.
The scale of the media revolution that we're living through now is clearly bigger than that of the past. But the impact on the politicians in the middle of it, the trauma of it, is very similar, I think. How do you operate in a world in which you can speak directly into people's homes? And so, in that sense of old forms of communication dying and new skill sets being required, I think there is something similar going on.
Trust in politics and news has been declining for years. With tech giants like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg in control of some of the world's biggest social platforms, men who aren't afraid to push their politics online, there are concerns for democracy as a whole. But what I learned from talking to both Robert and Lucy was that history teaches us to temper those worries. That again, we've been here before.
I'm not sure there is anything particularly real about the sense that things are different today. I think we're just seeing another period of adjustment around new media that have disrupted how politics is being done.
When you're changing your leader 7 times in a decade, then that probably suggests that something has gone wrong. But actually the ability to adapt and survive is an important defence mechanism of democracy itself.
So they're the 3 themes that exist in the midst of leadership churn. Talking to the historians, you get a sense that because something like this has happened before, it's unlikely British politics is in serious danger. But the question we're naturally left with is, what comes next? With similarities between today and the 1920s, does that mean our future will follow what happened in the 1930s, like the rise of fascism, division, death, destruction, and ultimately a second global war? Now, historians are great at talking about what's already happened, but they do not like predicting the future.
We wouldn't want to draw the historical parallels too tightly, because obviously things are different.
You can never anticipate the future. Historians always look backwards. We have no idea what our politics will look like in 20 years' time, and we should probably stop trying to guess.
But this is FourSight, and if the historians aren't going to help me, then I need someone who indulge me in a bit of crystal ball gazing. So I went to talk to Catherine Haddon, a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. So Catherine Haddon, I've been looking at the 1920s and comparing it to today in order to see if there's any parallels that we can glean about why we're having this current leadership churn. In both periods, we've had 6 or more prime ministers in a decade. Does that damage our country, or is the use of the word ungovernable just something the media keeps on using?
I do think it's really important that we look back at previous historical periods to realise that we are not the only era in which there is political instability, at which it feels like, everything is up in the air and you're not sure what's going to happen. The risk is that you look back on previous eras as if it was all inevitable, and it didn't feel like that to the people at the time. And I think that's the most important lesson from those eras is yes, we will keep going through periods where there is instability, and I don't think it's fair to say that we as a country are ungovernable. We have a functioning government. Public services are being delivered, not as well as people would like, but government is functioning in that sense. But obviously, we have a politics that is sort of deeply damaged and needs to find a new route and a new adjustment to the era in which we live.
But I guess crucially the difference between the past and the present is that often parties actually stuck with their leaders. They could actually have almost a long-term vision. They could lose elections and come back. They could be in office, they could not. And now, we've just seen Sir Keir Starmer win a landslide. He got just over 2 years. That seems to be a major shift.
But that's implying that there's some kind of godlike force above that stopped Keir Starmer having longer. Keir Starmer's departure was a consequence of the way in which he governed, the mistakes he made, and his political party's view of him. And those were true of, almost every prime minister. The 19th century is littered with prime ministers lasting, barely a year. And us going through sort of periods of high turnover. You can argue...
But a big change is, sorry to interrupt, is that back then they didn't have opinion polls. If there were no opinion polls, would Sir Keir Starmer have been able to finish 5 years and we might have seen perhaps a longer term vision or not?
I do think that the way in which politics these days is constantly sort of tacking to what is the latest opinion poll or, the focus groups is probably leading to them thinking about what's the political thing that we need to be doing here, as well as what is the best thing in terms of my vision for the country or what I think that, we should do. So yes, political parties are themselves feeding into this short-termism. There are things that they could do to reduce their own attention deficits when it comes to thinking about government.
Comparing the present to the past, the 1920s and other periods, historians have told us that it's often because of a big political shock, whether in the 1920s that was the aftermath of the First World War or what we currently are living through in the aftermath of Brexit. But populism is rising everywhere, multi-party systems all across Europe. Do you think we blame Brexit too much for something that's actually happening everywhere?
Possibly we do. I mean, Brexit was as much a symptom as it, could be ascribed as being a cause of where we're at. It showed a part of the country who felt left behind, felt very strongly that the direction of travel from the UK was not what they wanted and possibly was, felt like it was being imposed upon them. If you look at the aftermath of it, the way in which politicians have interpreted the referendum, but also the 2019 vote, that is still, looming large across a lot of our politics. What's the realignment? Who are traditional voters for any one party? And I don't think our politics has yet adjusted to what did that mean? What does that mean for the future of the political parties? Who do they now look to? Who are their supporters? So it's definitely having an effect.
That would therefore lead to this idea that are we heading to a point to deal with our current political churn towards proportional representation?
I don't know whether you can design an electoral system around the parties that exist. You should probably design that electoral system around what the public wants, around consultation around it, around a process of trying to find out what do the British people want. If we did move to a proportional representation system, our politics would probably change again.
I mean, it's difficult, impossible to predict where we go next when it comes to our next Prime Minister or the next 10 years. But when you talk about that adjustment that we're still going through, should we be careful about saying this is the end of the two-party system?
I think we should. I think we look at the Thatcher and Blair governments, as I say, as if that's the norm, rather than that's the abnormal. It's too easy to just look at the direction of travel that we're in and look for a parallel. The reality is history often is moved because of exogenous forces that we just didn't see coming. Take COVID, for example, take financial crashes. I think it's more likely that history or, what happens next has surprises in store for us, which could mean a return to, greater stability. If political class, media class and the public are all tired of it, then, we might find that it starts to settle down and the mood music moves on. But it's very hard. If you look back at any historical period, people at the time didn't know where it was going and would possibly not have been able to predict what did happen. So it's very hard to extrapolate forward.
Catherine Haddon, thank you very much. Thanks for watching this episode, and a huge thank you to Catherine, as well as Robert and Lucy, for letting me revisit my history degree. As I mentioned earlier, give our Brexit episode a watch too. If you like this, you'll certainly enjoy that film. See you next time.